So I think we often think of Easter as the end of the season of Lent, the culmination, right? We have Advent. Advent ends in Christmas. And so we've gone through these 40 days, 40 nights, this sort of symbolic period of time of Lent, of sort of groveling, of letting go of stuff, of sort of dealing with issues, riding in that sense of contemplation. And then we come through Holy Week, which has all of its elements of shadow and struggle and finality. And then we come to the end, which is resurrection. That's what we often think of, but in reality, that's not what it is. In fact, this is the first day of Easter. Today is the first day. This is the beginning. When you go back to think about what then happens, where is the end of the season of Lent? You come up with this ironic, awkward, and somewhat a little bit uncomfortable reality that it's the Easter egg hunt. Now, not for everyone. Some people will have the Easter egg hunt, and it will happen today after church. You might go home, you might go back to your house, but for most people now, because of the way in which a lot of us go out to eat, a lot of us do other things, the Easter egg hunt oftentimes happens on Saturday, just like ours happened yesterday, just like we had hundreds of kids out there, and they were all behind the little ropes and getting ready. And to me, it's a little bit awkward because in reality, there's nothing about Easter in the Bible. The word Easter is nowhere around. There's nothing about Easter eggs in the Bible. There's nothing about Jesus on Thursday night saying, guys, I hid a bunch of eggs out there in the garden. Surprise, go see what I got for you. There's none of that. It's something that happened around the 7th century because of this guy named Bede, this English monk, this old English monk who was familiar with both mythology and folklore and with the seasonal lore because, of course, people were so much more oriented towards season then and seasonal reality. And so he used the term in order to substitute it for a resurrection, which is new life, and that became celebrated around the time of the spring equinox, right? March the 21st, March the 20th, and so he gave it the name of Easter, which is after the old Germanic and old English goddess of fertility, whose name was Iestra or Iostra, and then the symbol, of course, of her goddessness was what? The egg, not the Easter bunny. And I don't even know how the Easter bunny got in there. I didn't figure that one out yet. But there's this idea, and of course it makes sense that eventually the egg became the symbol of the tomb out of which came new birth. And that makes sense. But then there's this whole other thing of Easter then that became, where the Easter egg hunt, how it finally transpired, still a little bit cloudy to me, but we know it happens. And we've all been a part of an Easter egg hunt. And our kids have been parts of Easter egg hunts. And I have always found the Easter egg experience to be troubling. I'm just going to be honest with you, because it seems like an experiment in social Darwinism. I mean, you line the kids up, right? And then the next thing you know, it's like this whole sort of reality of consumer capitalism, right? What's the objective of the Easter egg hunt? Get as many eggs as you can, right? And so when I would go to these Easter egg hunts as a kid, and we went twice a year and sometimes 3 times a year to the Episcopal Church where I was growing up in San Antonio. And so when we would have these Easter egg hunts, they would have prizes, not just the Easter eggs, but they'd have prizes. So if you could find the silver egg, then that would be awesome, because it might have a ticket in there for the big, huge 4-foot Easter bunny. Or if you could find the other ticket in there was the bike that was up on the announcer's stage, and you could win the bike. And it became this overwhelming tension. As you got there, you would notice there are kids that seem to have come together in large groups as though working in consort, like suburban Episcopal gangs. And then you would see them rush to an area, and there would be an Easter bunny that they brought along with them. A guy got dressed in a costume whose sole purpose was to distract everybody else while they went and mopped up around and grabbed up all the eggs. You just felt this overwhelming sense of competitiveness that would happen there. And sure, there were those other kids who I'm sure, were the sort of the odd ones that they had more of the, they were more about the hunt than about the take. They were more about finding that egg that spoke to them. You've seen them. They kind of wander. Maybe it was like me. That was the kind of kid I was. One of our kids was kind of that way too. I won't say which one because one of them's here, but I was one. They wander around, and actually Matthew, the one who is here, was more of the competitive spirit, grabbing the eggs. And I was talking to my younger son, who tended to be the one who would just stare at an egg and go, "Look, this one is rather chartreuse," and he would just stare at that egg, and that would be his take for the day. But he's telling me, my older son was at the first service, he was telling me, yeah, but nowadays, like we were at the egg hunt yesterday, and they're all behind the rope, and I went down and I said, "Molly," I said, "Molly, go to the distance. Get those eggs first, because everyone else is going to be stopped here and stumbling over the eggs up front. You'll get more eggs if you work from the back and work forward." And I'm looking at him going, "You're a preacher's kid," He's like, "Yeah, what else do you expect?" So, we understand that idea. But then I get, when I was 5 years old, sometimes would wonder with him, what would Jesus do in this kind of situation? What happened to this compassionate kind of orientation? Maybe I would be that kid who would, in fact, wander out and see others struggling, and I would stop long enough to hand an egg out of my basket and put one into their basket. We've seen those kids do that from time to time. Maybe I would be that kid who helped pick up somebody whose eggs dropped, or I would help someone else. But on one of my particular experiences, I was trying to feel just as competitive as the rest because I'm a fairly introverted kid, and I just knew that I wasn't going to get anything unless I got out there. I was watching that other group over there with their little gangs, and I decided to take it full on. And as I was feeling anxious, the whistle blew, and I don't remember anything. And by the time it's all over there, I'm looking out there. I'm standing next to my mom. I've got 5 or 6, maybe 7 eggs. Half of them are open. There's chocolate stains on my lips. I've got unwrapped candies in the basket. I'm looking out there. There's others wandering around aimlessly like a scene from The Walking Dead. And I'm wondering what happened. And before I get a chance to feel overwhelmed and disappointed, they say over the speaker, "Pony rides next door." And it saves the day. It seems odd that an Easter egg hunt has anything to do with Easter. It also seems like some of the worst, but maybe some of the best, can come out of that. And maybe, in fact, it becomes a little bit better example of what Easter is all about for us. Because the reality of our lives is that we do often feel trapped in our sorrow, or our disappointment, or fear, or competitive with the way the world is, or perhaps guilty because we didn't get the eggs that we wanted, we didn't get the life we wanted, we didn't get things going the way we wanted it to, or perhaps fear that we're going to get left out, or we're seeking some prize. Easter egg hunts are all about the reality of life, I think, in a lot of ways. And perhaps we cannot see the very stone that we've placed upon our own tomb or the tomb of another, the very way in which we sometimes unknowingly entomb one another because of our bitterness or our biases or our family baggage. And so Easter egg hunts remind us of the struggles of life. But Easter reminds us of an invitation. I've mentioned a friend of mine that I went to seminary with, a guy named Skip Johnson. He's a professor now at Columbia University, and he oversees the pastoral care department there, which is out in Atlanta, Georgia. But we went to seminary together over at Bright Divinity School, as well as my wife, and the three of us got to know each other very well there. And one of my favorite seminary professors at Bright, who's retired now, was a guy by the name of Glenn Rout, who studied at the Union Theological Seminary in New York, and he studied with the likes of luminaries like Paul Tillich, and then he studied later on with Walter Brueggemann, a great Old Testament scholar. He studied with all these people and then brought that back to seminary. And so when we would sit in his class, it was sort of like sitting at the feet of a brilliant man, and yet he was really down to earth. He would give us these long, drawn-out explanations for resurrection, possible understandings of what resurrection means, historical understandings, metaphorical understandings, literary and folkloric kinds of understandings. And then after all of that, he would say, but then who knows? Maybe it's just like Rover, you're dead all over. And then that would be the end of class. And I remember we had this one early class in his systematic theology class where he made this statement that we just laughed about afterwards. He was introducing some theological concept, and he said something like this. It was early in the class, and he said, "Let us call it simply the hermeneutical prolegma to existentialistic realized eschatology." And we were all taking notes, trying to remember, how do you spell hermeneutical? And then my friend Skip and I, we went out to lunch afterwards, and we sat down at the pizza place down on Berry Street, and we were sitting down laughing, and Skip says, "Did you see how he started that whole statement off with simply?" And we laughed and started to take it apart. Hermeneutical, how we look at things, how we make sense out of meaning. Existential, the very experience of life. Realization. Realization. We couldn't get our hands around why realization. What did that mean? It was like actualization. What would he mean by that? Eschatology, we understood. Eschatology, end times. We started trying to put all this together. And after about an hour and a half or so, in our first week of seminary there, we're having lunch. After about an hour and a half, we were already amazed at at the grasp we had of these theological concepts. In fact, we were already devising our own understanding of resurrection and our own understanding of salvation history and eschaton, the end times and such. And we were so proud of ourselves that when we got back to the car, he was going to his car, and I said, "You know what, Skip? Maybe the two of us need to just come together after the class once a week, and we'll meet here. We'll get some other folks here, and we'll sit down, and we'll kind of dissect this and figure out what this all means. I mean, we really got a pretty good grasp on this stuff." And Skip was about to say yes when I looked up at that very moment, for no reason at all, and a crow flew over and dropped one right on my forehead. I'm not kidding. It's one of my family's favorite stories. Like, you know, whenever they say, "Dad, you seem like you're acting like you know something. Where's a crow when you need one?" Because that's what. And Skip looked over at me and he said, "Tom, maybe we just remember to ask lots of questions." And that's pretty much the way that we've done it since, and pretty much the way I've approached it since. This reality of what is it really all about? I do now understand realized eschatology. And I'm going to do a little Mr. Rogers. Can you repeat that? Realized eschatology. You're going to leave with a heavy concept, all right? Next time someone comes up at you, and they start slamming at you with their theological jargon or their whatever they're trying to do, trying to convince you of this or that, and they're coming on strong and you're feeling the defensiveness, you just smile and say, "I'm comfortable with my own realized eschatology." All right? You say that, and that'll stump them for a while, and you can head out the back door. You can head down the other way. What is that? Realized eschatology. Eschatology simply means end times. It means final times. It means final things. Now, we think of that as, oh, yeah, those folks who sort of, they've got this self-aggrandized idea that they know the final date when everything's going to come to an end. Folks, things are coming to an end all the time. In the old days, back then, 2,000, 2,500 years ago, reality seemed pretty limited, pretty finite. You had maybe 50,000, 100,000 people within your vast understanding of reality as it was, much less what was a little bit beyond that, but you lived in a flat world. It had 3 little tiers, and it was covered up in a bubble. Now we have 7.5 billion people on this planet. And in any given period of 100 years, no matter where you're born, in any relationship 100 years to where you're born, within 100 years, 1 billion people will have died, maybe more. In 2011, almost 530 million people died around the world. A lot of people come and go in this reality. It's constantly moving. We are always at the end times. But that's what this story is about. This story is about we are also always at the beginning times. We are also always in every moment invited to participate in life, in the presence and the reality of death. And so we have things like this story, whose simple message is like Jesus himself, it's outrageous. The whole idea is simply outrageous. We're going to end here in just a minute with a song by Stevie Wonder. I want to tell you a little story about him and a thing I want to suggest for you. Stevie Wonder, blind, black, struggled all of his life for any number of disabilities, you might say, because of his skin color, but also even more so because of his lack of sight. But in 1976, or it was thereabouts, he had an accident, a horrible car accident that rendered him not just sightless, it rendered him without sense of taste, it rendered him without sense of touch or smell for almost a year. And he tells a story of how all that he could do really was hear. And when he could hear, he suddenly had this inspiration that his calling was to respond to always what he would hear. And so whenever he heard injustice, for example, his songs would speak out. He was one of the primary movers that called for a holiday for Martin Luther King. He was one of the primary movers in the civil rights with the music that he offered. And even as an 11-year-old child, he had this passion. But when he experienced that car accident, he suddenly had a realization, respond to what I hear. Resurrection is about being out of our tombs. But sometimes it's difficult to get out of our tombs. Sometimes we have to go there together. In fact, I would say that salvation isn't about your salvation or my salvation. This whole series has been on salvation. I would say salvation is about our salvation. That when we get so focused on thinking about only ourselves and whatever is going to happen to us and whatever afterlife or whatever time or whatever God's going to do for me now to help me with my problems, we've already stayed stuck in our tombs. That sometimes the only way and the best way to get out of our tomb is to simply reach through the stones if they're covering it and try to help somebody else out of theirs. When we participate outrageously, defiantly, we change the world. We bring about new life in the end times. And that's challenging. Augustine Burroughs, wonderful writer, some of you might know of his writing. He wrote a wonderful book called The Best Self-Help Book in the World. Or no, the best self-help book you'll ever need. And in that book, he talks about his own addiction. And one of the things that he said in there, which I grew up with addiction in the family. I grew up with all sorts of that kind of stuff around me. And one of the things he said, I just slammed the book shut and I just moved it aside. Because he said it in the chapter of getting rid of your addiction, he says, I'm just going to say it up front. And he said, turn on a light, get out of the room, and walk on. Just get up and stop and go on. Well, that's not that easy. I slammed the book, I shut it aside. It's not easy to get out of our tombs sometimes. And yet, that's what resurrection is. Resurrection is a spark of outlandishness. It's a spark of outrageousness. It's you hear something and you respond. It's you see the thing about Black Lives Matter and you get online and you say, why? And you respond. It's the thing you read about the United Methodist Church struggling with marriage equality, struggling with sexual identity and equality. And you think, why? And you read it and you respond. It's a friend you know who's in trouble or struggling. You respond. It's outlandish. Resurrection is never, I'll think about it. Resurrection is never, I'm just going to ponder on it. Resurrection is always, I hear, I see, I respond. And we got to go there together. That's the only way it happens. So this afternoon, when you leave here, here's what I'm going to invite you to do. I'm going to invite you to do something a little outlandish. I know some of you do this kind of thing all the time. I hadn't really thought about this, but I thought about the rolling away the stone, and DeAndre and I were talking about what can we do with stones and such, and I almost dismissed the whole idea of doing anything with rocks and stones because I think it's kind of kitschy at times, and I think some of the things we can do are sort of cliche almost. And then I was walking home from the grocery store yesterday afternoon, and I walked up on the step, and I kid you not, there was a stone on my porch, and DeAndra swears she didn't do it, and I think I know who might have done it, but then I've asked 4 or 5 people, and they said, I didn't do it. There's a stone on my porch that says strength, and it was just sitting there. And Linda said, how do you know it was for you? And I said, because I don't want it to be for anybody else. It's for me. And I said, it doesn't really matter. It was on the porch. And why was it on the porch? Maybe it was even at the wrong door for all I know. But the fact was, is somebody somewhere had an idea that said, I need to give a good word to something, to someone, and put it on the porch. It's a simple and sort of outlandish act. So I'm going to invite you as you're leaving. You can if you want. You might think of other ways that you're going to be outlandish this week, other ways you're going to represent resurrection in the world around you. But I bought a bunch of rocks, and they're lying around in baskets at the doors. And there's even some markers there, some Sharpies. If you don't have any of your own, you're welcome to take one. And I invite you to take one, take a stone, think of someone that you know. Think of your own self that you need to hear your own message, a word that represents how and what resurrection looks like. And just write it down. And then maybe pass it to someone. You never know. But life requires outrageousness. Amen.